Thank you for coming out. I'm Mark Mahaly. I'm the Dean of Vermont Law School, for those of you who don't know me. And it's a great pleasure to welcome you all to the Waterman Lecture, to hear Katie Redford, a really wonderful person who's going to give us a great talk, I know, and will be introduced by Stephanie Ferrier in a minute. I just want to give you, since it's my job, a little history. Why is this called the Waterman Lecture? And it's really simple. Our second dean, but really our first dean for all practical purposes, was a guy named Tom Debevoise, and Debevoise Hall next door is named for him. And when Tom became, his wife Ann is sitting in the first row right now, and when Tom became dean, he was on the board. Was he president? Yeah, he was president of the board, but he suddenly realized he had to take over. And so he became dean, and so he calls this guy, Sterry Waterman, who was on the circuit. He soon became a circuit judge, federal circuit judge, and said to Sterry, you know what, I'm going to be dean and you're going to be president of the board. And Sterry Waterman said, well, I have to ask my wife. And she said, well, this of course is urban legend, but at any rate, she said, well, you know, if Tom Debevoise asks you to do something, you have to do it. And that's how Sterry Waterman became president of our board. And then Waterman Hall is named in his honor, and the Waterman family gave generously to endow in substantial part this lecture series. So we have a Waterman lecture every year. And it's a great pleasure, Katie, to have you here for it. So without further ado, Stephanie, would you please introduce our speaker?
Hi, everybody. I'm so delighted to have this opportunity to share Katie Redford with the Vermont Law School community. Just a fabulous lawyer who knows how to use the power of law to bring about change in the community and the world. So you can see a perfect person to share with the Vermont Law School community. Fortunately, she made it out of DC before the weather really hit. She might not make it back, but you know, might get stuck here. It turns out there's some Vermont connections already, right? So one is that her cousin lives in Montpelier, and her cousin's husband clerked for Sterry Waterman, and he's a Vermont Law School alum. Okay. In addition, her husband, who's a Burmese human rights activist, Kasawa, went to SIT, the School for International Training, in Brattleboro, got a master's degree there, another Vermont connection. We walked into the office of the Asia Partnership this afternoon, walks in and Yan Mei Lin is standing there, and she and Katie go, hi! So they had first met in Beijing about 4 or 5 years ago, before Yan Mei joined our staff. So it's a special delight to really cement that relationship between Katie Redford and our law school. So her story of how she, sort of went from law student to lawsuit, this landmark lawsuit against Unocal and Total for human rights violations in Burma. The subject of the film, I sent you the link in an email a few days ago to the film Total Denial. I think she might be sharing some about that story tonight. Nothing like turning a law school paper into one of the most famous cases in human rights. But she didn't stop there, and founding EarthRights International with her husband, continuing on this very, very important work, suing Chevron and then Shell, and then she'll talk about, I think, some of the cases that are ongoing now. Really such important and special work. I am delighted to introduce to you Katie Redford.
Wow, it's so great to be here, and I just have to say that I am so impressed with the turnout. I went to quite a different law school than Vermont Law School. I went to the University of Virginia School of Law, and let's just say that when I tried to get people to come to hear people like me speak on a beautiful day without any threat of snow, there would be like 6 people there, maybe. And that was usually because it was my friends who I asked, who I dragged out of the hallway and promised I would buy them beer after the talk if they would come and please listen to someone talk about human rights and pretend you care. So thank you so much for coming. I'm just amazed, and this is such a cool space, and what an incredible law school you all go to. Really, really impressed with everything that I've seen today, the students that I've met today and before, and just really, really glad to be here. So anyway, I might be a good lawyer, but yep, there we go. Okay, I did it. So what I want to talk to you about today is one of my favorite subjects. You know, you can probably tell I'm a people person. I love people. I love hanging out with people. I love having dinner parties. I love talking to my friends. I love meeting new people, people like you. And so I thought to myself, what am I going to talk about? You guys said, you can basically talk about whatever you want. And I said, all right, I'm going to talk about one of my favorite things, which is people. And so to start out, I want to introduce you to one of the most powerful people in the world. This is Shell Corporation. They are the second most powerful person in the world. And you're sitting here going, Katie, look at your slide. That's not a person, that's a building. And yes, it's true. It is a building. But housed inside that building is Shell Corporation. And as we know, or as you will know by the end of my talk, corporations now in the United States, especially after a few landmark cases over the past 5 years, are considered people. They have rights as people. Thank you to these people for giving them those rights. I'm talking, of course, you probably all know about the Citizens United lawsuit, which just celebrated its 5th birthday last week. 5 years ago, the Supreme Court gave corporations First Amendment rights as people to give basically unrestricted amounts of money to influence elections and campaigns. Now, let's remember, I know you guys are all really smart, but corporations don't have mouths, they don't vote, and yet they have First Amendment rights after Citizens United. Now, let's be clear, the Supreme Court did not invent this idea. Corporations and the idea of corporate personhood has been around for a really long time. It's actually quite an old concept. It's been, the notion of corporate personhood and legal issues around corporate personhood have been around for about 200 years. So they did not invent corporate personhood, and I'm not going to go into a lecture about corporate personhood tonight because you guys can go to law school classes about that. That's not why I'm here. But what did happen that was new after Citizens United was an unprecedented amount of money in politics, which led to the creation of super PACs, which led to the creation of, well, not the creation, the increase and the worsening, in my opinion, of political attack ads that in some cases are just downright mean. They're horrible, right? And politics has gotten nasty, and our rights as real, living, breathing humans, persons, have been lessened because corporate rights have gone up. Now, you also might remember there's been quite a bit of good comedy that's come out of this too. There he is. Mr. Romney, I think we're going to be hearing more from him. And I'm from Massachusetts. I thought I escaped that a long time ago, but apparently not. You may have heard his gaffe in the election, the last election, and you may have heard about Stephen Colbert's super PAC, which was awesome. So some, good comedy has come out of this. But all in all, since Citizens United, and then what many call Citizens United 2, the McCutcheon v. FEC case, which even expanded corporate rights under Citizens United, and then more recently, the Hobby Lobby case, which gave corporations religious rights. Again, they don't have mouths, they don't vote, but they have First Amendment rights to influence elections. They don't pray, I don't think, and they don't have souls from my experience, and yet they have religious rights under the Hobby Lobby case. So this is the situation that we're living with right now with regard to corporations. And so I'm going to pause there for a minute because I don't really want to talk about corporations very much longer. What I really want to talk to you about is actual human beings, the people that I care about, real, living, breathing humans whose lives have been upended by the increasing and overwhelming corporate power that happens and that we're experiencing in the world as corporate rights are on the rise. Real, living, natural persons whose rights, environments, homelands are violated every single day as corporations go out into the world to extract resources, to get land, to make money, and to do good sometimes. Real human beings. Human beings like the people here. These are people who were being shipped off to Auschwitz, many of whom did slave labor for corporations during the Nazi years. People like this who were gassed by Zyklon B, which was created by a corporation and sold to the Nazis. Those companies in Nuremberg were held accountable for their role in slave labor in the creation of gases like Zyklon B. This is history, the history that our human rights law today is born on, and the history that we must build upon as we move forward into a world where corporations are getting more and more power. So let's talk about the people of today, the people who stand against corporations. People like my clients, Jane Doe 1. Stephanie mentioned the case that launched my career as a lawyer. Jane Doe 1, whose name we can't reveal because she would face potential retaliation by the Burmese military dictatorship, who went into a partnership in the early 1990s with Unocal, a United States corporation, and Total, a French corporation. And for those of you who are students and might be too young to remember, the Burmese military dictatorship in the 80s, 90s, and until a couple years ago was one of the most notorious, brutal human rights abusing regimes in the world, notorious for slave labor, for forced labor, for rape, for ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity. And it was this military dictatorship that an American oil company, Unocal, went into contract with to build a gas pipeline across Burma and exploit the gas resources of the Andaman Sea. Jane Doe 1 was a young woman with a young family living in a village in Burma where the pipeline was meant to cross. So first, her village was forcefully relocated. In Burma, that means the army comes into your village, guns pointed, blazing, and basically says, you have a day, you have 2 days, you have a week to move your village to get everything out, and if you don't, anyone here will be killed. Her husband, John Doe 1, another one of my clients, was taken by these soldiers to do slave labor on the pipeline route and on pipeline roads. Slave labor for this American project. And remember, you guys, we've all taken contracts, right? The oil company went into a contractual agreement with the Burmese military to provide security for the pipeline and to procure labor for the pipeline. And so what did the Burmese military do to procure this labor? It did what it always did. It enslaved people. It took people by force and didn't pay them and wouldn't let them go. And so her husband was taken and he went to work on the pipeline. After about 12 days, when his food and water ran out, he escaped, and the Burmese military came to their village looking for him. And Jane Doe 1 was sitting in front of her house when the Burmese military, on Unical's watch, came looking for him. And they said, "We're here. Your husband fled from the slave labor," they didn't say slave labor site, "from the work site. Where is he?" She said, "I don't know." And they said, "You're lying." And they beat her. And at that time, she was nursing her baby, her 2-month-old baby, in front of the cooking fire when they showed up. And they started beating her, and they kicked her, and they hit her with their rifled butts. And they kicked her so hard that she fell into the cooking fire with her baby. And her baby eventually died from these injuries. So Jane Doe 1 and John Doe 1 were my clients, along with a number of other people who did slave labor, who built helicopter landing pads and other pipeline infrastructure for Unocal. Women who were raped by soldiers who were guarding Unical's pipeline. All of this in the name of security for this American oil company. And we brought the lawsuit against Unocal for their complicity, for their role in these human rights abuses. And in 1997, this case became the first case ever in the United States where a US court accepted jurisdiction over a corporation for human rights abuses overseas. And in 2004, it became the first time ever in which a company paid victims of human rights abuses compensation for their harms. And so 10 years after I met this woman and heard her story and heard of her suffering at the hands of this American oil company, and 10 years of fighting with this company who said, "We will never give those people a dime," let's just say that they got what they called justice when Unocal had to pay for the human rights abuses. First time that a company paid for human rights abuses outside of the United States. And so the Unocal case allowed people from Burma to come into an American legal system, into an American courtroom, and tell their stories, tell what happened to them, to stand up and say, "Here's what this company did to me." And it didn't end there, because sadly, these kinds of people, you don't only find them in Burma. There are corporations all over the world doing these kinds of things. Here's another one of our clients at EarthRights, one of my clients, Ken Sarawiwa. How many people know who Ken Sarawiwa is? Okay, that's great. So Ken Sarawiwa, was an Ogoni activist from Nigeria, a poet, a playwright, and he organized in the early 1990s Ogoni indigenous people from the Niger Delta to nonviolently protest against shell corporations' decades of the destruction and pollution and poisoning of Ogoni land in the Niger Delta as they extracted and sold billions and billions of dollars worth of oil and gas from the Niger Delta. After all of these decades, what did the Ogoni have? They had poisoned waters, poisoned lands, sick children, sick animals, inability to drink their water, inability to breathe their air because of gas flaring that went on 24/7 for years and years at a time, and still in some places continues today. Ken Sarawiwa organized the Ogoni people to nonviolently protest what he called the ecocide of Ogoni land, Shell's war on the environment. And for that, Shell collaborated with the Nigerian dictatorship. He was abducted from his home, he was tortured, he was imprisoned, and ultimately, after spending almost a year in jail, he and 8 other of his friends and collaborators were sentenced to death and hanged by the Nigerian military, all for standing up to speak out against Shell and the destruction of their homeland. Penn's last words before he was hanged on November 10th, 1995 was, "Lord, take my soul, but the struggle continues." And it does, and it has. There was another case that went up to the Supreme Court a couple years ago, and maybe some of you have heard about it, and maybe some of you have studied it, on behalf of different members of the Agoni Nine. Ken Saro-Wiwa was one of the Agoni Nine. There were 8 others who I mentioned were hanged on the same day, all for their role in protecting Agoni land from Shell's exploitation. The Colbert case, Colbert versus Shell, was a similar case to the Ken Saro-Wiwa case. And what I should tell you, I alluded to this. So EarthRights, after they were executed, represented a number of Agoni, including Ken Saro-Wiwa's surviving family members, to sue Shell for the torture and execution and their role in human rights abuses associated with their activities. And again, same kind of situation, contractual arrangement between the oil company and the military or the police in Nigeria. The military hired or under some contractual obligation with the oil company to provide services for that company. And so, again, building on the Unocal precedent, we sued Shell, not an American company, a Dutch-British company, in United States court for the human rights abuses associated with these deaths as well as a number of others. And 10 years later, in 2008, after Shell, again, just like Unocal said, there's no way we're paying for this, this happened in Nigeria, blah, 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 blah. And those Nigerians are scheming, money grubbing, looking at the deep pocket. They are never going to get an ounce of our money. They got much more than an ounce of Shell's money. And Shell compensated the family members of the victims and paid to set up a fund in Nigeria to start the process of cleaning up Agoni land. And another case, not our case, was filed shortly after that on behalf of a different member of the Agoni Nine, Dr. Colbert, who also was executed. That case had a different route, and unfortunately, it ended up at the Supreme Court a couple years ago. Now, this is the same court that I was whining a little bit about and joking a little bit about at the beginning of this talk, that gave companies First Amendment rights to free speech, gave companies religious rights. Okay, so this Supreme Court now gets this case of Agoni people suing Shell for human rights abuses that happened in Nigeria, Colbert v. Shell. And I sat there in the Supreme Court and I listened to Shell's lawyers argue to this same Supreme Court that corporations cannot be held accountable for human rights abuses because they're corporations. Governments can, individuals can, but not corporations, because guess what? They're corporations, not persons. And I have to tell you, you're laughing, and I had at that point, she was like 13, 14-year-old daughter with me. Thought, okay, this is cool. I can go to the Supreme Court. I'm gonna, let my kid check this out. And she leaned over and she said, so wait a second. The corporations are persons when it's good for them, but when it's bad, they're corporations? And I was like, yeah, basically that's what they're arguing. And so my kid figured it out. And I think the Supreme Court felt a little bit uncomfortable with what they were being asked, because they were like, okay, just 2 years ago we gave these companies rights as persons. Now they're arguing that they should have no responsibilities for torture and execution because they're corporations right now. So something really unprecedented happened. In fact, it's only happened twice in recent history. First time was with the Citizens United case. Second time was with the Colbert v. Shell case. A week after the oral arguments, when we were all sort of like, I wonder what's going to happen, and there's no way the Supreme Court can be so hypocritical, we find out that the court says, we don't really think the issue is whether corporations are immune from liability and whether corporations should be held accountable for human rights abuses. Because clearly they either had to say, well, if they have rights, they must have responsibilities, or they had to just be completely transparently corporate friendly. So instead they said, we're going to order a re-argument on an entirely different issue that wasn't in the briefing and that no one raised or was supposed to raise. We're going to order a re-argument. You have to come back and do it again. This time the question is going to be not about whether corporations can be held accountable for torture and killing, but whether corporations can be held accountable for anything if it happened outside of the United States. So they moved the goalposts. I mean, they're not done, they are the Supreme Court. And went back, heard it again, and almost 2 years ago, the Supreme Court came down and said Shell cannot be sued for human rights abuses that happened in Nigeria because there is a presumption against extraterritoriality, the extraterritorial application of United States law when the abuse happened outside of the United States. Now, of course, any of you who have taken human rights law know that human rights law is all about transcending national borders, and that there are some crimes, some abuses that are so heinous that you should be able to prosecute or hold the bad actor accountable, no matter where you find them. And that was precisely what we got out of Nuremberg, so that these things would never happen again. And here we are, 2 years ago, and our Supreme Court of the United States says that our courts, there is a presumption against extraterritoriality. We've got some work to do, people. Now, there is some hope. I mean, of course, I'm hopeful because I'm a human rights lawyer, so I have to be an idealist. Because they said, even though there's a presumption against extraterritoriality, that presumption can be rebutted when the acts at issue touch and concern the United States with sufficient force. What does that mean? You know? I mean, it kind of sounds like porn, right? Touch and concern. But do you know it when you see it, guys? Is that what this is? Like, touch and concern with sufficient force. And they pulled that out. It's not like, it doesn't mean anything. And so now, as human rights lawyers, we have to, when we go to sue corporations, we have to be able to say, okay, if it happened outside of the United States, we have to show that it touched and concerned the United States with sufficient force. So that's what we got from this building, which has those people inside of it. We have a situation in this country where corporations have vast and increasing rights with very few responsibilities under the law. We have a situation where this person, living, breathing human being, has no rights anymore in this country to seek justice for torture and execution. And this person has all the rights in the world. Is this a world we want to live in? I don't think so. So like I said, we have some work to do. But there's hope in Chiquita. Now, this is why I have hope in Chiquita. Chiquita is another company that we don't just go after oil companies at EarthRights, we go after fruit companies too. Chiquita hired paramilitary death squads in Colombia to secure its fruit growing plantations down there. And on their behalf, these paramilitary death squads went out and, well, what do paramilitary death squads do? They kill people, and they torture people, and they disappear people, and they force them off their lands. And that's precisely what happened in Colombia as Chiquita went to grow fruit there. And a couple years ago, actually many years ago now, the Bush administration, Bush 2, went after Chiquita actually on anti-terrorism laws, and they charged Chiquita. It turns out it's illegal after September 11th to hire terrorists that are on a list. And the ones that Chiquita hired were on that list. And so the Bush administration went after them. Chiquita copped. They said, guilty, we did it. Yep, not gonna argue. And they paid a $25 million fine to the US government and went on with their life. What about the lives of the people who had family members killed, who were tortured, who lost their lands? Those are the people that EarthRights represents and that are our clients, also known as John and Jane Does, in a case that we brought against Chiquita. And after the Colbert decision, we all said, okay, how are lower courts going to apply this touch and concern with sufficient force standard? What are they going to do? They're not going to know what to do. And so this is going to go back up to the Supreme Court. And we all said, where the best case that could go even to the Supreme Court is this case on Chiquita, because how can you argue that what happened in Colombia doesn't touch and concern the United States with sufficient force when the Bush administration went after them? Obviously it touched and concerned someone in George W.'s office, and with enough sufficient force to charge them and for Chiquita to cop and pay $25 million. It's pretty clear. So the lower court in Florida didn't quite understand that, so they dismissed our case on Colbert grounds, and we were like, great, you dismiss our case, we're going up. So we filed a cert petition at the end of last year, and I mean, probably the Supreme Court is going to be like, oh, we're not going to touch this, and they won't grant, but we'll see. So there is hope, because I can't believe that if this court takes this case, that they will be able to say that when our government on anti-terrorism laws investigated and charged this company, that they're also going to be able to say, it doesn't really concern us, never did. So watch out for that. But let's be clear, these are extreme situations, hiring paramilitary death squads, oil companies hiring the Nigerian military, the Burmese military, and yes, they're egregious and awful, and so they're good cases as lawyers to bring to set precedent, to advance the law, to move what we're trying to move forward. But it's a small number of people, thankfully, that have to deal with these kinds of human rights abuses around the world. What about the environment? What about the rise of corporate power and how it's impacting every single one of us on this planet? All those companies after Citizens United who can now put whatever they want into elections and campaigns so that the Keystone Pipeline gets built, so that we don't have a good energy policy, so that we don't do anything on climate change. This is going to affect all of us, and we have to be creative and figure out new ways to deal with this new threat. Because to me, what are the threats to the planet? We've got extractive industries and ever scarce resources. We've got deforestation and land grabbing at an alarming rate. Less and less land, more and more corporations and people who want it. Climate change, all of these huge threats to the environment, and yet the biggest one that ties it all together, the biggest threat, in my opinion, is corporate power. And so whether you care about human rights, earth rights, the environment, you have to care about corporate power. And we all have to figure out ways to roll back this incredible wave of privilege that has already taken over our Congress, has already taken over the executive, and now the courts are bowing as well. So, like I said, we have a lot of work to do, and we have to find new ways to do this. So at EarthRights, we basically try everything and figure out what works and what doesn't. We have a case against Occidental Petroleum, which is a California company that has spent the past 4 decades or so polluting the Peruvian Amazon down in South America and destroying the water, destroying the fisheries, destroying the land, and destroying human health. And because it was an environmental case, according to our courts, we couldn't bring this under the same law that we used to bring the case against Unocal or Shell or the Colbert case, which is the Alien Tort Statute. That law only allows you to bring cases for customary international law violations. And I won't go into what that means, but basically it's human rights laws that the whole world agrees on. And sadly, the whole world, according to US courts, doesn't agree on the environment. And our courts are not going to enforce, for now, international environmental cases that are purely environmental, because they say, well, that's the environment. We're not going to get into that. But state courts will. We might not be able to call it, torture or killing or rape, but we can call it assault and battery. We can call it negligent disregard for the environment, all kinds of tort suits in state courts. And so we brought our case against Oxy on behalf of indigenous people from the Amazon in California State Court, where Oxy is headquartered. Because guess what? They're there. They're there in California. We sued them there. And Oxy is going to pay. And we're going to probably be announcing something more official, but you heard it here first in the next couple of weeks, so look for the EarthRights press release. But again, 10 years of fighting us and the Ashwar people from the Peruvian Amazon, they're going to pay for this mess, and they're going to clean it up. Okay, so state courts are a fabulous place. And look at your state laws. Figure out who's incorporated in your state and go after them at home. This is gas flaring. I mentioned it earlier in Nigeria. There's also this exciting new law that we actually stole, or legal strategy that we stole from Chevron. You've probably heard about the case in the Ecuadorian Amazon where Chevron, you know all about that. Chevron also has gone after activists, NGOs, with all kinds of harassment in the past couple of years, one of which is using part of our discovery system. The 1782 discovery law, remember that, people? Who thought that it could be a tool for taking on corporations? Chevron definitely didn't, but if they can do it, so can we. So 1782 is a discovery provision in the US Code that says if there is a foreign legal action in another country and there's a party to that legal action or an interested party or a related party in the United States, we can get discovery on that party. So in Nigeria, a group of Nigerian lawyers sued Chevron in Nigerian courts for the practice of gas flaring, which is burning gas waste into the atmosphere 24/7. It's causing all kinds of health problems. The Nigerian courts have called flaring a human rights abuse. But guess what? The Nigerian courts can't reach Chevron. And even if they could, their discovery is not nearly as broad as ours is. But we, as US lawyers at EarthRights International, can file a 1782 case, discovery action against Chevron. We can get documents, we can depose their executives, we can get interrogatories, all kinds of discovery, and hand it over to the courts in Nigeria to help our friends there get a little bit more power over a company like Chevron. And we did that, and we got the documents, and we got the discovery, and now it's in court in Nigeria. So again, it doesn't always have to be us standing up in court doing our own case. We can help our friends around the world who are dealing with American companies every single day. Oil and gas, mining, extractive industries. I'm going to tell you about one more case. So have you guys all heard of the publish what you pay rules? You've heard of Dodd-Frank? The Dodd-Frank Act. There's a provision of Dodd-Frank which basically requires mining companies and oil and gas companies to publish or to make transparent and public any information about payments to foreign governments or militaries. So if, Chevron goes to Nigeria and does a deal in Nigeria for oil and gas, they have to be transparent and say what they paid to the military, what they paid to the government to get that deal. Well, that's one of the provisions of Dodd-Frank. Of course, the industry's fought it tooth and nail. And the SEC, which has to regulate and write rules to regulate these companies under Dodd-Frank, decided, you know what, we don't want to deal with the oil companies and the mining companies. We're just not going to write these rules and see if anyone notices. And just let things go on as, that's not a direct quote. I'm summarizing what we assume they said. And so we decided, you know, you have to write the rules, you better write the rules, people, and they were like, and so then we sued them. See, we sued lots of people, not just oil companies. So we sued the SEC and we said, come on, write the rules. And corporations fought back. And guess what they argued? They argued in their defense that they had a First Amendment right to make secret payments to foreign governments and militaries. And guess what? They were successful in those arguments. Yeah. Some work to do, but that's okay. We sued the SEC again, and we're going to win this time. So keep your eye on that. But like I said, there are tremendous threats to the environment: climate change, incredible weather, extreme weather coming from climate change, and corporate power. These are the things that we have to worry about. These are the things that we have to fight. There are so many ways in which this manifests. And as Stephanie mentioned, this is where you come in. The Unocal case that I talked about, Jane Doe 1, my client, this was an idea that I had in law school. I spent one of my summers on the Thai-Burma border, and I met people who had been harmed by this gas pipeline. I met survivors of human rights abuses, witnesses who said, this is your American oil company. What are you going to do about this? And I was like, okay, it's not my company. But still, right? And they were like, our people are being killed. Our people are being enslaved. Thousands of people have fled into Thailand and Bangladesh and become refugees because of this pipeline. And we've written letters to the oil company. We've written letters to President Clinton asking him to stop this company. We've written letters to the World Bank asking them not to fund it. And nobody has done anything. So Katie, and this is, you know, I was a law student, my summer job. If we've written all these letters and these terrible abuses are happening, would it be illegal for us to blow the pipeline up? I was like, only a second year. We haven't learned that yet. Maybe you teach that here at BLS. They definitely did not at UVA. So, you know, I did what every good law student is like, okay, if you don't know the answer, just pretend you do and say it with authority. And I was like, well, I really think that that's just a bad idea. And what you should really do is sue. Because I learned well in law school. And of course I thought to myself, well, duh, I've taken human rights, slave labor, torture, rape, genocide, ethnic cleansing, definitely illegal. I remember that. And then I got back to law school and I talked to some of my professors and they were like, no. Yeah, it might be illegal, but you can't do anything about it. You can't sue because corporations are only subject to the laws of the land in which they operate. And I was like, well, that's stupid, because I remember in law school, on the first day, one of my professors said, the law is always changing, and the law is always there to deal and to evolve, to deal with new problems. And maybe that corporations are only subject to the laws of the land in which they operate worked 10 years ago, but this is the age of globalization, people. It's 1995. You know, come on, almost the 21st century. Wake up. Globalization, economic globalization, there certainly needs to be globalization of law and justice. Corporations are everywhere, and when they do good or bad, they can't be nowhere when it comes to being sued and having jurisdiction. And so, you know, I was like, well, my professors once said the law is there to be changed, you just need the right case. And we thought that the Unocal case was the right case. So I wrote a paper, I took an independent study, spent a semester, and I wrote this paper called Unocal in Burma, you know, suing corporations for human rights abuses overseas, Unocal in Burma, a case study, and I wrote the paper. and handed it to my professor at the end of the semester, and got it back a couple months later with red everywhere. Luckily, it said A- on the end of it. I was like, whew. But he goes, Katie, you've written the best possible paper that you can write with a losing argument. This will never happen. It's unconstitutional. It's a terrible idea, and it's impossible. And I was like, well, you're just saying that because no one's ever done it before. And I think you're wrong. And so, we set out, we founded EarthRights International, a friend of mine from law school, and Burmese activist, who's now my husband, so that worked out. And we set out to prove this professor wrong. And we got a grant from the Echoing Green Foundation, got fellowships from the Echoing Green Foundation. We started EarthRights International. They gave us $35,000, and we were like, woohoo, let's sue an oil company. And we did, and we sued Unocal, and like I said before, it became the first case. 2 years out of law school, we made legal history because we had the right facts, and because we wouldn't take no for an answer, and because it was urgent, and the situation demanded it, and we did it. And so this is my challenge to you, because the situation is urgent. The facts are egregious. Corporations are out of control, and our planet needs us, needs you. It needs those new, crazy ideas that probably your professors here will think are awesome, but not where I went to law school. And it needs that energy and that innovation. So whatever it is that you care about, whether it's human rights, whether it's the environment, whether it's corporate power, whether it's all of it, because it has to be all of it. Come up with a crazy idea. Don't take no for an answer. Go out and do it because we need you. Thank you. Okay, any questions? Comments? Yeah.
Did you ever send a note to that professor who told you?
Oh my God, yes. So that story actually does not end there, but yeah, I sent an email to him in 1997. I think it said something like, nah, 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 nah. But he wrote back and he was like, oh, Katie, I'm so proud of you, but this is just the battle. You haven't won the war, and I believe that I still believe what I believe, and I think it's going to be overturned. Well, that professor's name is Jack Goldsmith, who you guys probably know. He went on to write torture memos for the Bush administration. And then even he resigned from the Bush administration. He wrote a book called The Terror Presidency. He teaches at Harvard now. And in addition to that, he is an expert witness and a paid consultant for oil companies in every single case that we bring. And it gets worse, or better, depending on how you think about it. When I was sitting in that Supreme Court listening to the Unocal Case, we all knew that Justice Kennedy was our guy, right? Like, okay, we know what these four are going to do. We know what these four are going to do. Kennedy was the swing vote in Citizens United. There's no way that he can give them rights but no responsibilities. So Kennedy's our guy. Well, Jack Goldsmith clerked for Kennedy. My professor was Kennedy's law clerk, so he had a little bit of an inside track. And he also wrote the brief, the amicus brief for all of the oil companies and mining companies who submitted in support of Shell in that case. And as the lawyer on our side, started his opening arguments. Who's the first judge that interrupts the opening statement? Kennedy. And what does he say? He says, counsel, I'm looking at page 17 of the Goldsmith brief. And I was like, are you kidding me? Here he is again with his red pen, 17 years later in the Supreme Court. Like, this guy is never going to go away. So, yes, I wrote him, and I'm still writing him. And I think this story will continue, and I hope to write him another note after the Chiquita case, and we win a little bit back of what we lost. But it's a long haul, and, you know, what you learn in law school and who you meet in law school, for better for worse, can be with you for your whole life. And we actually have a very cordial relationship, and I will say that I spoke at Harvard Law School about, I don't know, 10 years ago about this, and this was back when we were winning and when I was right. And like 2 days later, Jack spoke at Harvard Law School. It was a total coincidence, and the same students were at both of our talks, and the students said, you know, Katie Redford was here a couple days ago, and she said this about shell and corporations, and he was like, well, and I heard this from the students, he said, well, I guess Katie is right for now. So once he said, not to my face, but publicly, that I was right. I'm going to go with that. That's good.
If you're aware of anything that other jurisdictions, like other countries, are doing legislatively or otherwise for decisions that are holding their corporations accountable.
Yeah. Oh, so the question is, right, are there other countries around the world that are doing similar things? And for the longest time, the United States, you know, ironically, because it's not like we've been the banner actors on international law recently, but the courts were sort of our bright spot, and this was the best place to go if you were a human rights survivor or victim. But not anymore. For the moment, our court's doors have shut a little bit after the Unocal case, but that makes doing this kind of case in other countries all that much more important. And in fact, so the UK now has laws, and a judgment just came down against Shell, actually, for harms in Nigeria, just last week, I think, or a couple weeks ago. So, and it was for like $85 million or something like that for against Shell. So there are other countries that are doing this. The UK, in fact, in '97, when we filed our case against Shell on behalf of Ken Saro-Wiwa's family, it was initially dismissed. Second Circuit said, look, this is a Dutch-British company. You can sue them in the UK or the Netherlands. And it turns out back then you couldn't. There were no laws on the books in those countries that allowed a right of action against a corporation for human rights abuses overseas. So since that time, like, our case actually highlighted that for them, and they've passed laws, and there are cases going forward. But there's actually Shell's in trouble everywhere, but they're also being sued in the Netherlands. Just got sued, just paid out a big judgment a couple weeks ago in the UK. And then, of course, it doesn't just have to be the sort of Western developed countries. I mean, in fact, there are places, Thailand, for example, where we have an office, is starting to accept cases in their courts for harms that have happened, for example, in Laos or Cambodia. And their National Human Rights Commission is investigating allegations against corporations that happened in Burma, Laos, and Cambodia. So this idea, it's actually, I mean, the US is falling behind. But other countries were inspired by what we did here in the Unocal case, and that other people have done too. So, but it's a trend that needs to happen regardless of what's happening in the United States. Human rights abusers, environmental abusers, those that would do harm. Because imagine if these companies are going to, be complicit in killing babies and executing activists, what are they going to do to forests and rivers and mountains that can't stand up and fight back, So we have to be able to hold whoever accountable either in their home court jurisdiction or the host country jurisdiction where these things happen. And this is something that we work on in many of the countries around the world, working with lawyers, trying to make them litigious lawyers like us for justice. Forbes magazine called us many years ago international ambulance chasers, and we sort of took that as a compliment. You noticed.
We have time for one more question, and I know you're going to have a little bit of time later, so I'm going to exercise a prerogative and let you ask me a question.
This is actually a law question because I haven't had anyone really answer this question yet. But in my research for my paper that I'm writing about Nike v. Caskey, which was a California, you know that case?
Yeah.
I'm sure you do.
Mm-hmm.
So it was like 2002 or something.
Yeah.
So I was confused because I was looking at the docket, and in the docket, basically, there's actually it's that the United States is acting as an amicus for Nike. And
back in 2002.
Yeah,
Uh-huh.
yeah, and it actually says it's from the U.S. Supreme Court, which doesn't make sense because wouldn't that be conflict of interest? Because the case eventually went to them.
Yeah, that doesn't make sense.
Yeah, and this was actually for the California Supreme Court when they actually ruled for the citizen.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
So that's why it was like really confusing because then the case ended up going to the Supreme Court when they had already decided it in this amicus brief. So that's why I was like, is that legal? And
that doesn't sound right to me, but I don't know about this, so I probably should not comment on it. But I will say that I am not surprised that the U.S. government back in 2002, I mean, every case against a corporation came in on the side of the corporation. It wouldn't, I don't think, come from the Supreme Court. It would come from the Solicitor General or from Ashcroft or at that time. I think it comes from the Office of Legal Counsel, which is where Jack Goldsmith, my professor, works. So he may have written that one. And I'm serious. Yeah, that doesn't make sense to me. But I would have to look at it. I don't know enough about how that works. But the Supreme Court doesn't write amicus briefs.
It says it on there.
Yeah, maybe they submitted it this thing. Yeah, that's weird.
It was
Yeah.
Well, yes, I think our short time is up.
I just wanted to give a great thank you to Katie. And we're gonna, the school is not done with her yet. We're gonna stay in touch. So thank you very much.
Oh, thank you.